Hello, welcome to the Davis Museum virtual panel, What's in a Game? A discussion of Sondra Perry's It's in the Game 17, or Mirror Gag for Vitrine and Projection. My name is Regina Gallardo. I'm a junior from Mexico City studying art history and Latin American studies. We will begin with a native land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that Wellesley College is built on the ancestral and traditional land of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize that the United States removal, termination, and assimilation policies and practices resulted in the forced settlement of Indigenous lands and the attempted erasure of Indigenous cultures and languages. We further acknowledge the oppression, injustices, and discrimination that Indigenous people have endured, and that there is much work to be done on the important journey to reconciliation. We commit to strengthen our understanding of the history and contemporary lives of Indigenous peoples and to steward this land. We further recognize the many Indigenous people living here today, including the Massachusetts, Wampanoag, and Nipmuc nations, who have rich ancestral histories in Wellesley and the surrounding communities. Today, their descendants remind us that they are still here, where they maintain a vital and visible presence. We honor and respect the enduring relationship between these peoples and this land, as well as the strength of Indigenous culture and knowledge, the continuing existence of tribal sovereignty, and the of tribal self-determination. Now, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Amanda Galvin, the Sonia Nova Corner, Senior Curator of Collections and Assistant Director of Cultural Affairs here at the Davis.
Thank you, Regina. And thanks also to Davis student employees, Ashley Visram, Tiffany Chu, Mariela Flora Hernandez, and Yangqing Li for supporting this event today. We are also always grateful to Curator of Education and Programs, Arthurina Fears, for convening us. Thank you and welcome to everyone who's joining us today. And special thanks to students in Professor Jordan Tynes' Introduction to Video Games, Professor David T. Olson's course, Virtual Form, Professor Carrie Cushman's Introduction to Photography, and the Wellesley student athletes for joining us today. I'm delighted to offer brief introductions to our speakers today, and you can find their full bios in the chat. Today's talk is in conjunction with the Davis's presentation of artist Sondra Perry's It's in the Game 17, or Mirror Gag for Vitrine and Projection, which will be going on view soon at the Davis. We're grateful to Sondra Perry and the Bridget Donahue Gallery for loaning this video installation to the Davis, where students from computer science, art, athletics, and more are engaging with its challenging examination of how race, gender, and power shape our experiences of higher education and activities like museum going and video games. So between them, today's speakers have written a stack of books related to today's conversation, and I encourage you to buy them for yourselves and request them for your university libraries. Our first speaker will be Dr. Soraya Murray, Associate Professor in the Film and Digital Media Department at the University of California, Santa Cruz. It's a treat for me to welcome another graduate of the Cornell History of Art and Visual Studies PhD program. And don't miss her book on video games, The Visual Politics of Race, Gender, and Space. She will be followed by another Cornellian, Dr. Samantha N. Shepard, who is an associate professor of cinema and media studies in the Department of Performing and Media Arts at Cornell University, and the author of the important new book, Sporting Blackness, Race, Embodiment, and Critical Muscle Memory on Screen. We will then hear from Dr. TreaAndrea Russworm, an associate professor of English at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and a series editor of Power Play, Games, Politics, and Culture out of Duke University Press. And her book, Gaming Representation, Race, Gender, and Sexuality in Video Games, is a must-read for everyone here. And Wellesley's own Jordan Tynes will then join all three of our presenters to moderate a conversation. He is co-director of the Media Arts and Sciences program and Hess Fellow and visiting lecturer in computer science at Wellesley College. And students, if you haven't taken a course with him yet, I encourage you to enroll now. I'd like to first welcome Dr. Soraya Murray.
Hello, and thank you so much for this wonderful invitation and for that generous introduction. First, I want to say thank you to the artist foremost for this wonderful work, which gave me so much food for thought, to Dr. Amanda Gilvin for the invitation, the co-panelists, and everyone who helped to make this event possible. In looking at the many reviews for this work, it's in the game. One of the things I was really noticing is that there's actually little dedicated consideration to the idea of this work actually operating very much around the medium of digital games. And as you know, I thought that as an art historian and a visual studies scholar who's kind of gone over to the dark side of video games, that I might offer some thoughts in this regard. So one of the things I was thinking about is how video games really matter as a form of visual culture, because among their many attributes, they're very powerful and widespread forms of visual culture. They are highly persuasive simulations with value systems with which a player engages. And I think Sondra Perry's work is very much engaged with all of this at the same time as topically dealing with the specific matter of the lawsuit around the appropriation of images without permission. So for many, video games are actually the first means by which young people become conversant with digital technologies. And I think we tend to forget that, right? So as a medium, games are 60 years old, but they're really dramatically understudied as visual forms. And it remains a challenge to kind of draw sufficient scholarly attention to the critical force of the simulated image in general and video games more specifically. So like other mass culture forms, there are sites where struggles for recognition take place. These include matters of race, gender, sexuality, and power. And as technological forms, they're also very deeply connected to a larger conversation about the encoding of technologies with perceptions around race and gender. And I think that Perry's work touches like very, very potently on all of these topics. So in my own work, I use these games to understand ideologies around technology, science, and their imaginaries, and also the mechanics of power within our technological lives, which kind of underlies all of this. And so I'm really interested in this idea that games have this vibrant and extensive and very lucrative existence, but one that remains somewhat under the radar of some of the most important critical conversations of art and visual culture. And so that's one reason that I'm very happy that we're having this conversation today. You know, I think one of the interesting, I would say, ways in which this work pricks the attention of the high art discussion, right, that's going on is that it appropriates the tools that originate in science, in the military, in industry toward very alternative ends. And so artists have long embraced these kinds of technologies almost as quickly as the technologies have been innovated themselves. And so the use of these tools by Sondra Perry in particular strikes me as flying in the face of what we understand art to be, right? From a place of connoisseurship or a perspective of quote unquote good taste and what is quote unquote fine art, right? Also, I think what's really important to think about is who is perceived to be the innovator and wielder of such a technology, right? That is also like very highly ideologically determined. And so one of the things I'm thinking about is this kind of bombast of technological fetishism and masculinism that's present in the tech world in general and very pronounced in the video game industry and in, I would call it like player culture and game culture. And so Perry's use and utilization of these technologies is of course in keeping with the fact that all of this technology actually belongs to her, right? That in the sense of likely having grown up with games, just like other Americans of her generation, of it being a part of her own visual literacy, right? But as we know, such games have not necessarily been for or about us, right? And so they have not necessarily been thought of as being ideologically sort of a belonging of our own, right? But they are, right? And so I'm really excited by the way that artists are starting to really utilize these game technologies in works that probe into new areas of representation, into the personal, the political, the contemplative, of which this is one very significant example. So from my vantage point, I was just thinking of a few things in relationship to this work specifically. These are the notion of artifacts, thinking about simulation, importantly, this notion of skinning, and then also the idea of decontextualization. I know we just have a few minutes, so I'll go through them quickly. And then hopefully in the Q&A, we can talk about some of these things more. So I was struck first by artifacts, right? This kind of dual meaning going on in her work of cultural artifacts as byproducts of Western development, right? As an extension of colonial expansion. And then this other meaning of an artifact as a byproduct of software development, right? Which are elements to do with the processes by which software actually comes into being, right? So this is played with in the work and kind of points to a critical mass that is gathering around repatriation of the cultural artifact, but also thinking about all of that which lies around the possible production of some form of software. I was also thinking about simulation, right? The idea of bodies in non-spaces, bodies as rendered completely controllable. Some would argue that simulated computational images are even of an altogether different order, right? And this is a conversation that has gone on for some time now. Notably, the late renowned filmmaker and intellectual Harun Farokhi described the computational image as what he called, quote, strange new images which are somehow on the verge of competing with and defeating finally the cinematographic photographic image, so that the era of reproduction seems to be over, more or less, and the era of construction of a new world seems to be somehow on the horizon, or not on the horizon, it's already here, right? So he talks about this in terms of his own work, his parallel series, a few other things that I think are really very much in conversation with the kind of work that that Perry is doing, and in the suite of works that he did, he presented the kind of simulated computational image for its hollowness, right? Exploring the limits of the worlds created, the architectures created, and the status of what were fundamentally hollow objects. This leads me to the third point, which is skinning, right? And that's that polygonal modeling in simulation where you can skin or reskin a kind of mesh or wireframe style shape. And that's how, you know, the three-dimensionality of form in games is created, right? So people have begun to discuss this both as a rendering problem, but also as an ideological problem, particularly when you start dealing with bodies, right? Bodies with subjectivity. So often in video games, blackness in characters is often thought of as a matter of reskinning, right? Which is a very shallow engagement with difference in terms of an idea that our difference is skin deep, right? So it's a technical problem that points to an ethical and ideological problem. Last is decontextualization. And I was thinking about this in terms of the way that the image circulates in the digital, right? The digital potentially circulates in ways that we have not yet even, I think, begun to fully comprehend, right? And in this, I was thinking of Hito Steyerl's wonderful essay in defense of the poor image, which I recommend to everyone. It's easily found online, where she's in this case speaking of the circulation of images that are intended to circulate quickly. They're propelled into global networks. They create new publics, new translations, new mistranslations. They're degraded, right? The poor image, she writes, is quote unquote no longer about the real thing, the original. Instead, it is about its own real conditions of existence, right? About swarm circulation, digital dispersion, fractured and flexible temporalities. It is about defiance and appropriation, just as it is about conformism and exploitation. In short, it is about reality, end quote. So she describes these as kind of perfectly integrated into informational capitalism. And I was interested in thinking about how these images that Perry has produced are an extension of that conversation about our bodies, right, in under the duress of informational capitalism. That's all the time I have, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much. We'll now invite Dr. Samantha Shepard.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for convening this event. And I want to thank our organizers, all of the students who are here and who have been involved in this process. And of course, my co-panelists, both of whom whose work I deeply admire. So I'm just going to jump in so that I can get my time started and going. I'll hit start. And I want to talk about a few things. And I want to also thank Sondra Perry for this really rich work, which gives us an opportunity to think about a lot of things, both games, representation, sports culture, cinema, as well as, sort of their implications of cultural histories and embodied histories. So a couple of years ago, I actually invited TreaAndrea Russworm to come visit Cornell. And as I recalled, she had a reference to Dave Fizdale, who was at the time the former Memphis Grizzly coach, who went viral with a post-game conference rant or sort of screed about the officiating of a game. And Professor Russworm mentioned sort of the famous takeaway line, which was "take that for data." And so one of the sort of key aspects of that was that David Fizdale was saying things aren't adding up. And so I've been thinking about that concept of take that for data and the idea of games and sports being so invested in numbers, numericalness, data, biometric data, to think what happens with this piece that tries to explore the idea that things are not just adding up. And so the other aspect of this title, it's in the game 17, is it's also called Or Mirror Gag for Vitrine and Projection. And the mirror gag itself is a reference to cinema, particularly to the Duck Soup film from 1933, starring the Marx Brothers. It's a pretty famous scene. Basically, two of the Marx Brothers, Harpo is pretending to be Groucho's reflection, and Groucho is trying to exhaustively see if it is his reflection, till finally another brother arrives and sort of the ruse and the confusion, it is over. But this idea of thinking about likeness, thinking about reflection, thinking about embodiment and representation is really crucial, both to cinema and to that scene, but also to the ideas around sports and sports' relationship to film and visual culture. So with this piece, there's obviously the engagement with EA Sports. It's in a game, as that being their slogan, but also to the question of Black interiority in this game. What's in the game? Who is in the game itself? My work is particularly interested in thinking about Blackness in terms of sports media, particularly film and visual culture. But at the same time, there's really this question about Black embodiment and what the surplus expressivity of Blackness can do. What happens when you look at something and it looks familiar to you, but it isn't actually familiar. And I think what Perry does so interestingly here is she first begins this work with the attention to herself, that she's looking at her brother, right, her fraternal brother, who there's a familiarity, right? There's DNA, but they're not identical, obviously. But the idea of twinning something seeming recognizable but not exact, And then thinking about what does it mean for Sandy, her brother, to actually look at these images of himself, look at the images of other players and feel a recognition, but also not feel a recognition at all. So Perry calls this abstracted subjection. And I think that's something that actually carries over to sports films and sports media that often tries to abstract subjecthood to flatten out particular kinds of athletes and athletic narratives so that they feel familiar but aren't exact. So much so that we have to sort of read Blackness and read these narratives against the grain, or more importantly, re-narrativize on top of them. So I also find really interesting the spectatorial practice that we watch. We don't just watch Sandy playing the game, we also watch Sandy playing the game and re-narrativizing the bodies, which I think is a nice tension to the kind of take that for data narrative of like, okay, these are what the stats say, but this was my roommate. Oh, this person came from here. Oh, he was a really nice guy. Oh, he could go lights out. So this re-narrativization gets at something that is a concept I like to think through, which is critical muscle memory, which you can only get when there is subjecthood, when there is an individual, when you do not just have a body that isn't anybody, but that is a body that is somebody, a body that has a referent point. Another scene that I found really interesting in this piece was the sort of computational technologies around trying to show the relationship between the real basketball world that her brother is playing on the court and the sort of technological computational world that she's trying to abstract that we'll later get when we get the many different Sandys that come in the sort of black and white scene. And the reason why I want to bring attention to that moment is because there's something about what becomes lost in the translation of that, the physical movement, the humanity. And we also hear the idea of lost and found because the sonic layer over that image is the sort of reading and recordings of like acquisition notes from an expedition. It's supposed to be telling us what this is, but it's actually not telling us a history, a culture, a memory, all of these things. It's just telling us what the things are. So I can say, okay, they are, 5 from 10 from the line. Oh, they can go, they weigh this much, this is their percentage of threes, but you're not getting a history of, oh, but if the game is really, if the right elements are in place, oh, there's one day the person just went off because there was a mix of all of these elements. You're not getting the actual narrative of the moment. You're just getting facts that denote time, but themselves become ahistoric. And I think that's why that is a really interesting sort of moment between Sandy narrativizing and then later when we have the multiplicities of Sandy, as well as I just want to also make sure within my time, I mention the question of likeness, of course, has its legal purposes, because this isn't just a visual digital media installation, but it's a 3-part installation. Not only do we have the very sort of grotesque computational version of Sandy from the inside, which I said, oh, no more of that. Let's close that tab. But we also have the image of Sandy and Sondra over the legal documentation that came with the lawsuit over the issue of likeness. And now this, of course, has a lot of cultural relevancy to this modern moment because, we just had the Supreme Court uphold the idea that athletes can be paid for their likeness. Now, not only we didn't have that before, but just a couple months ago, we also had the Supreme Court uphold the idea that the NCAA should be paying athletes or that they're, that athletes should be able to profit in some way off their image. And so this question of likeness has a lot of resonance because in that little moment, and as we also see in the actual just main 16-minute video, is this question of how you qualify or how you don't qualify for remuneration, right? So if you have this number of points, and then this again goes back to that sort of inciting thematic, take that for data, because it's, if things don't add up exactly, you are not there's no recompensance for your embodied abstraction. Another thing I also wanted to point out is that what I found really interesting in this conversation, or excuse me, in this visual representation, is this question also, as Dr. Murray pointed out, this question around artifacts that ends up having us think about what does it mean to think about Blackness, particularly sporting Blackness, as an artifact, both as a visual archive, an embodied archive, a repertoire, and at the same time can be computationally understood and played, but also therefore invites these other kinds of fantasies of power, of control, of ownership, of mastery, that really complicates our understanding of whose body is it, whose artifacts, whose museum, whose items are being reproduced, which is why those earlier reproductions that saturate the entire work, from the Met, as well as, it's not just the Met, the Met and the British Met, is really interesting because it's also this question of reproduction, that again gets us to likeness, but also to what becomes abstracted in these technological re-envisionings of what sporting Blackness could be or was. And so I just want to end my opening sort of conversation with, again, take that for data. What happens when we ask ourselves, what happens if things don't add up? And more importantly, what is the power of our own spectatorial practices as players, as we saw with Sandy, who was able to engage and re-engage the game and re-narrativize the bodies that were just framed as somebody, or as anybody, but are particularly some bodies in distinct and distinguishing ways. Thank you.
Thank you. And we now welcome Dr. TreaAndrea Russworm for her presentation.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I'm so glad to be here today. And I appreciate this opportunity to talk about this amazing work. So I'm just going to make 4 points today. One is that Perry's work is procedural, and I'm going to talk about what each of these things mean. But the first thing is that Perry's work is procedural. The second is that it's an example of speculative design. The third point is it's also Afrofuturist. And then the final point that I kind of want to reflect on here is that I think a work like this really indicates the future direction of video games. So I'm going to end with this like broad, proclamation about the future of an entire medium and how we arrive at that by engaging this kind of work. Okay, so to go back to this point about the first point, which is this work is procedural. And by that I mean that it is a meditation on procedural representation, which is how a work, usually a computational work, makes arguments through our engagements with its rule-based processes, right? So it's how computational processes make arguments, how they're rhetorically making arguments, even when there's something very abstract happening, right? Not necessarily a story-based game or a story-based world, but you're just doing something or not doing something. And as a rules-based and process-based work, Perry's It's in the Game, actually, which we can see how it's a rules-based and process-based work through its like spatial and temporal manipulations, through its appropriation of the computational spaces, but also in the ways in which like it also has a set of, it like engages and evokes its own computationally based processes. For example, we can see the use and manipulation of like digital tools like Blender and the creation of some of the digital 3D objects that we see in the exhibit. And just bringing all of this together, right? That it's, even though it's not an interactive game per se or an interactive space per se, though I think certain versions of this do have some level of interactivity, it is also sort of mimicking and critiquing a set of rule-based, like procedural processes. So importantly for me, in game studies and in game design, I think procedularity and procedural representation, all these derivatives of this term, procedural, are not usually discussed in a context that has anything to do with race, right? It's usually just what can we do as we maneuver our digital avatars, what can't we do? So let's take, I'm just going to throw out some popular games that may resonate with some people in the audience. A game like Dark Souls, which is like a notoriously difficult game. You know, instead of having on the screen, this is a notoriously difficult game, you find out it's a notoriously difficult game because of its combat mechanics and how often you're going to fail at them, right? So you constantly fail. There are also games that have a permadeath mechanic, and that means when you die, you die. You start over, right? You don't get to save where you were and restart from a particular moment in the game. And that is what, all of that particular outcome, that when you play a level and you die, you permanently die, you go back to the beginning, that process of playing and dying in those ways is making arguments about how difficult the game is. That's just one example of like how we might think about this term procedularity and games. And so, as I said, though we talk a lot about procedural logics and procedularity and procedural representation in game design, we don't often talk about race. I have written about the racial logics, the procedural racial logics of sports games, sports video games in particular, like NBA 2K and NBA 2K16. And so in that case, I made the argument that there are these assumptions that we as players bring to a game like that, where you're able to simulate for decades and decades and decades into the future, like a particular franchise, basketball franchise. If you're Celtics fans out there, I'm sorry, but if you're Celtics fans out there, you could simulate the future of the Celtics franchise and also manipulate what happens in that future, right? Impact that future. And by being able to tweak its numerical representations of the players who are on the roster, right? By being able to draft new players or bring old players back who left the Celtics, you can rebuild and reimagine and simulate that franchise. And that is a whole procedural process of playing that game that gives the player this illusion of control, right? Gives the player this sense that I am in charge of the destiny of this franchise, and by proxy, all of the mostly digital black bodies and players who are a part of this experience or part of that franchise. So I make an argument about the managerial side and procedural aspects of sports video games that give players this sense of power and control, and how something like the cinematic mode or the story-based mode, and in the case of NBA 2K16, it was a story mode created by Spike Lee, how a locked-in, non-interactive or less interactive story mode has the potential to subvert those assumptions, much to the player's dismay. For example, in the 2016 version, where you were fixed and you had this fixed identity as a twin. Interestingly enough, in NBA 2K16, you played as a twin who was Frequency Vibration was his name, and you were a fraternal twin to a black sister. And so I write about how that decision to have that story in that game and in that mode actually subverts a lot of the procedural logics and assumptions that the franchise has been noted for. So as a procedural work, Perry's It's in the Game is doing its own sort of investigation of the rules-based processes on which games exist, on which they depend on, right? But it's also creating a critique. It's also critiquing other procedural logics that are related here. And most obviously, the procedural world of Black college athletes' engagement with college athletics, right? So that where there are these rules that said you cannot get paid. We don't care how much money you make. The college, how much money you make, the towns, or whatever, you shall not get paid. Those were logics. Those were procedures that the college athletes were subject to. So one of the powerful things about procedural rhetoric and procedural works, both computational and otherwise, media-based, digital, other sort of media arts-based works, is that they have the potential to indict and to critique and also to engage in these other patterns of procedural sense making. And in other examples we can see here, museums and the question of access and inclusion, what are the rules of the museum space, what are the objects or the artifacts, as Dr. Murray mentioned, that we are engaging, how did they get there? All of these things start to be or in flux and can be examined in a different way when you sort of utilize the power of procedural rhetoric. So that's what I think is really fantastic about this work, is how things like the legal procedures, the legal jargon, the legalese that we hear on loop in the work is also indicted here. Access to education, access to museum spaces, how all of these things are put in motion by making these powerful arguments about one seemingly particular thing. So they're all connected in that way. The second point that I was making, that I want to make here, is that it's speculative, right? Which is, to me, very inspiring. So this is the realm of possibility, of probability. You could argue that all video games as simulations are speculative, but I think speculative design implies an intentionality, an intention to do something with that material, right? So as a speculative design practice, I think we can say what's inspiring here is the potential to speculate, to dream, to comment, and to critique, but also to imagine something new that is personally meaningful. So we get the personal location of this author's story and her relationship to her brother and her family, but we also get something that can be collectively impactful. And in this case, there's also sort of another term I'll sneak in there, is remediation. And the objects that are being used here are family photos, digital images, game footage. This is machinima, which is using game assets and game footage to other ends or outside of the game, right? It's in the game and it's also outside of the game. So I think what's most notable to me when you think about the possibilities of speculative design is how what we really want to hone in here is not just the process and the practice, but the ideology and the values. And I think in computer science and in computer sort of computational practices, we need more of this. We need more of this, this fusion of art and music and literature, but we need these sort of ideologically porous and reflexive contributions that are also computationally purposeful, right? And so this inspiration where there's more pluralism in design, where you have a broader set of a critical apparatus that is broader and is more intentional, bringing that to computer design and having that loop around and wrap into these other sites of like cultural location and personal location, I think can be everything, right? So we really need to see how the speculative links these different fields, humanities and computational based fields. Afrofuturist, I'm going to throw that out there, as this is absolutely Afrofuturist, even as it remediates and thinks about both the past and the present. And I'm going to use one of my favorite quotes from the Black imagination on Afrofuturism, which is that Afrofuturism considers time, technology, culture, race, and it focuses on Black speculations about the future in ways that foreground Black agency and creativity. It's often explored through film, art, and music, and now I would say through video games and through our engagements with video games, importantly. Which leads me to the last point, which is that the future of video games and what this work indicates for us, I think, is that the future of video games is beyond video games. If I had to say what's to come in video game production and video game design, I would say that that's really besides the point. I'm not thinking so much about what the content of games is as I am thinking about our engagement with games. So the future of video games is extra diegetic, which this work is as well, right? It's about games and it's about a bunch of other things. And so I think and I hope that we can all take some inspiration from that, from a project like this, where we're ready to open games up and explore games, critique the computational logics, the cultural locations and investments of games and their content, but also use that to think about ourselves, our relationship to the world, our relationship to often exploitive and unfair practices and processes, right? So to use games in an outward fashion. I think that's where we already are with games, where games are sort of secondary to engagement. And I think a work like this further draws our attention to it. And since I'm the last speaker, I think I'm right at 10 minutes, so I don't want to go on. I'm going to leave time for, I'm a little over 10 minutes. I want to leave time for our discussion.
What a generative way to kick off this discussion. So Dr. Russworm, please stay on and we'll invite our other colleagues to join in conversation with Jordan Tynes.
Thank you all very much for your sharing your abundance of ideas to chew. Definitely not enough time in the 20 minutes we have left, but thank you for that. And also thank you to the Davis for putting this together. And thank you for your attendance today, for those of you who are here. And of course, the artist and her collaborator, her brother, on creating this work. I have a few questions that I have thought of as you all were speaking. I have a few that I prepared ahead of time, but I also want you all to feel free to comment on each other's ideas and presentations as we go along. So feel free to, if you're wrapping up an idea, to jump in and talk about something else that someone else said. I think that's a great way to proceed. But I do want to suggest maybe one of my students in computer science 121, Intro to Game Design this semester, has a question about engagement with games. And so I think it tails really nicely with what was just said about the future of games. And so Connie, I don't know if you want to join us for just a moment and offer your question.
Yeah, sure. So my question is that teenagers actually learn a lot from games and like can potentially like mimic the game characters. So do you think game characters that represent like marginalized communities can serve as a role model for teens from these groups? And if so, how can game developers do better in terms of the representation of marginalized communities to like ensure visibility and authentic representation?
Okay, well, I can start us on that topic. I'm sure there are other people that will have some things to say about this. Do I think that representational of racially marginalized people matter in games? Absolutely. And, you know, one example I would turn to, well, I mean, sports games, for example, since we're talking about sports games, have the largest potential, I think, or from a representational standpoint. I think I've made the argument that like sports games are the most diverse genre of games by the simple fact that they represent players in like professional sports like the NBA, and so you're gonna play the NBA, or previous to this the college the college sports games, and you're gonna be playing characters or people that are racially diverse, right? So like sports games racially or at least visually seem to connote that type of diversity. So there's that. But what I've argued in other ways and in other places is that that's not enough, right? That you want to know who has agency in the design process, who has agency in like the distribution process. So you want to work closely with communities that are being represented So yes, you want wider, more racial diversity in games, and then you want to work with those communities in close ways. So in the case of the sports games genre, it's making sure, obviously, that people are fairly compensated for their images, their likeness, their labor, which this case with EA Sports and the NCAA is an example of how that was not happening for decades, right, before, prior to now. So you wanna fix those things, those predatory practices that are hardwired into the industry. You want to fix that. And then in terms of fictional games, and then on the sports game side, I think active work with the communities that mostly play those games, like Black and Latinx players who are sports YouTubers and like play these games repeatedly. There are community development managers that sometimes are better than others working for these companies that have a relationship with those communities. And sometimes there's pretty exploitative relationships among the players and those companies, where the players are basically doing all this marketing and free advertising for those companies. And I don't know that there's a very sort of clear reciprocal process there where they benefit directly as much. So you want to work on all of that, even when you're in the territory of having diverse racial representation. But in fictional games, I point to the example of Miles Morales' Spider-Man, because I think that's a game that, appeals to younger audiences, to whom I think this question is probably even more essential and more urgent. And how that's just really cool that it exists. Right? There are some challenges, I think, in that game, but at least trying to like culturally locate Miles in Spanish Harlem and making sure that like he has these sort of cultural signifiers that make sense for who that character is. Make sure that the voice acting and the other people participating behind the scenes in that game are present, and again, making sure that some of the like ideological implications of the story itself resonate with that gesture. All of those things are things that are not just at the level of like computational design, but impact storytelling and like the circulation of games in all ways. I think that it requires an attentiveness to lots of things at once, and it's worth it. It's worth it to pursue that and to figure out all of these different components that would make a game work in that regard. That was a long answer, but yes, it matters. That's the short version of that answer. I don't know if anyone has anything else to
Does anyone have anything to tag on to that?
Yeah, it relates to the more theoretically to the concept of skinning that I think Professor Murray was talking about, that theoretically is really rich territory for exploration.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. And I think that, first of all, I think it's a really great question. And I think it's a question that we need to keep asking ourselves. But I think the notion of reskinning is really important, and for designers to think about what it means, right? That one's subjectivity does not operate at such a shallow level, right? And that when we think about video games, I mean, there are two things going on. There's this reskinning issue, right? That you can't simply pop another skin on a character and claim to have created a diverse game, right? It just doesn't work that way. I think people used to think that, and they've realized that that's no longer possible, right? And then the audience expects more. The second thing is also that over the years of studying this and teaching it with students, I mean, I think I've really come to understand that it's not simply a matter of replacing a wrong representation with a right one, because, but also many and varied representations all throughout games, right? So we just, because right now I'd say there's a clogging of certain kinds of representations. Like, let's say if we talk about Black representation, it's in like sports games, and then like games to do with like crime or something like that, right? Which is kind of emulates television in a way. And I feel like we have to think very differently about also the placement of these characters and how to build like rich worlds around them. And as Dr. Russworm mentions, to make them like legible as who they are within the spaces that they're presented, right? Not just reskinned, right?
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Connie, for bringing up that topic. All of you touched on a topic in some way in your presentations of artifacts, and I mean, they're really prominent in this work, and they're shown in many different ways. And I'm thinking of, you all seem to sort of allude to the 3D representations that are constantly sort of spinning and flying about in the video projection. And there's also this tour that happens in the video, the tour of the Met and the British Museum. And it's, I'm thinking of games that also attempt to tour historical content, and games that represent historical time periods, and how troubled many of those representations can be. And I'm wondering if there's some sort of unique crossroad being present in this work of the digital games that we're looking at that represent historical cultural material, but also maybe are there lessons that we can learn from the ways that museums present this work? And is Sondra Perry's project here offering some commentary on that crossroads?
I could begin with that a little bit. I mean, I think that question of artifacts and the museum is one that is old. I remember there was this amazing book I read, I think by Sally Price, called Primitive Art in Civilized Places, which was a scathing critique of this problem, right? And I think that the use of game technologies to critique this version of history that we see in museums is really, really brilliant in this work. And I would love to see more of that. I think the museum has struggled with interactive media and how to absorb it into its practices. I think that this is a really great example of an intervention that really, really works, and that doesn't just collapse into the very problem that it portends to critique. And I've mentioned this very briefly, but I think that's also very connected to the use of something that's considered low or popular culture. And I say that with scare quotes because I don't really share that feeling, but the use of something that is thought of that way, popularly speaking, to make such a critique. I think that's a very important part of the work. And I think it's a way that games and interactive media can come together with a kind of activism that's at work in this piece.
I would also add, just from my own perspective, that I think one of the things that I really like about this piece and reading about its various installations is how much it is about not just, and I'm almost sad of the way I've had to interact with the piece, but it is about the entire sensorial experience. So it is the room that's supposed to be painted also chromatic blue. It's the 3 different kinds of installations. It's, I was reading, it's the basketball metal framing is what it's, structures the different screens. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, because it's also, you're hearing the stylistics, like you're here, like it's sensuous in a very, very complicated way, in the way that makes us think about museums as something that you're supposed to feel and see and experience. That's why when there's the replication of the screen within screens, and we get to see her and her, and I love that sort of familial version of like, Sondra, I have a place to be. I don't want to be on this, doing this again, right? The repetition, but the experientialness of going into the place and then thinking, and we get to see that, the smile back to the camera, all of these kinds of things that we can think about, sort of what it means to confront and interact. That's why I think the question of spectatorship, as much as it is about participation, or spectatorship has to include elements of participation, that I think is where the relationship between game studies and thinking about visual culture that requires thinking about the senses and the idea of either tactility or the desire for something that is more physical or phenomenological to be experienced. But that's just some thoughts.
I've just popped a link into the chat, but I was also thinking of artifact in terms of other artists working with the notion of artifact and the museum. And I thought of Morrishan Aliari, whose work I think is really important in thinking about recuperation. So it's interesting because the artist's works are very, very different from each other, but they're both kind of speaking to this notion of artifact. In the case of Morrishan's work, she's thinking about how to recover destroyed artifacts and create digital artifacts around the artifacts themselves, so that it may either be remembered though it's destroyed or recreated with 3D printing though it's been destroyed, right? As a way of appropriating back what was destroyed during conflict. So I think there are myriad possibilities for how to engage with this particular topic from a digital standpoint.
I have a question in the Q&A that I'd like to bring up, and I think it's important because this piece also uses these legal proceedings as source material. And when I watch these, I wonder, a question comes up in my mind of what do these legal proceedings miss in terms of thinking about how to, I don't want to diminish them because since I think these proceedings are really important for highlighting issues with labor and student athletes and injustices regarding that. But there's a question here about how you reconcile the opportunity to central marginalized voices in gaming, both on the development and gamer side, with the anti-progressive movements like Gamergate in the field. And I think this brings up this idea of what conversation about games it gets elevated in sort of mainstream news and mainstream culture, and why aren't we elevating some of the other issues that we've been talking about today as quickly?
Well, I guess my kind of initial thought about that question is that we just go ahead and we put the resources, we train, we recruit, so if you think about all sides of production, of game design, you recruit actively into your programs, all right? You prioritize, you hire people from marginalized backgrounds who are going to help create a culture around game design that is going to do something different, that is going to center these voices. You put the resources into that, into public humanities and outreach initiatives that even attract and engage pre-college audiences, these same sort of Black and Latinx and BIPOC communities of color who are playing games. You work in all facets to change what the industry is and to also acknowledge but not shy away from that culture, right? That the voices of marginalized people, of both players and designers, are always going to be important and are always going to also take place and take shape in the context of these harassment tactics and white supremacist tactics. That has been the case for the games industry as a whole, like since its inception. There has always been a sort of culture hardwired in that way, and it's also been the case for people living in that greater social political context, right? That there's no kind of getting around that. So I think you double down in this climate and the here and the now and the going forward. You double down in ways support ways to support those designers, potential designers, and player audiences. And you try to make games, you try to create a culture around making games that offers an opportunity to see these alternatives. Yeah, that's short answer to that is, and you know, why is it that these are not the experiences that we hear about? Well, we understand why that's the case, right? We understand that from a sensational standpoint, the stories of marginalized gamers, like a work like this even, you know, is not going to make like an active news cycle for a lot of reasons. And then also, even when you had something like Gamergate, one of the statistics that I was always struck by were the people of color, the women of color, and the non-binary people of color who were targeted well before there was any sense of what Gamergate was or what was happening there, that these were groups and people that were targeted pretty aggressively within gamer culture, right? So we know that these things predate some of these milestones that do have traction in a kind of public recognition sense. So all of these things have always been there. More than likely, these challenges will persist, but we double down on who we want to be at the center of this discourse.
I just want to make sure, check on time. Amanda, do we have maybe a chance for one more question?
Yes, one more question.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, since there are a fair number of students here today, this may be a good way to wrap up, who are thinking about their own voice in respect to designing games and their own experiences and trying to find that. And do you have any advice for students who are working to translate their own experience into a meaningful game experience for others? And how to best maybe center, feel equipped to go forward and make their own meaningful contributions to this medium.
The advice that I'd like to give is, of course, I think to do anything, you have to do it as well as you can and pursue excellence in what you do. But I think that it's important how you think about what you're doing. And one of the things that I always like to teach my students is that this is a medium that has always already belonged to you, right? It's not something that you're an interloper in or that you're appropriating as yours. It is actually yours already. So do with that what you will and just do it excellently. And I think that the industry will actually be better for all of the things that it has sought to excise from its stories and visual culture. It will only be enriched by the original voices that come to the industry, and that will make it better, right? So own it. That's my advice, is realize that you own it already. It is your visual literacy.
There's a great question in the chat about violence, and so I'm going to try to give my piece of advice in a way that answers that question. And my thought is violence is always othering, right? No matter what kind of othering we're talking about, to be violent is to automatically other. So I think make nonviolent games. But, we had a challenge over the summer with some of my students to make an anti-capitalist first-person shooter. And my students thought it could not be done. You can't make an anti-capitalist first-person shooter. And in fact, what they found is that our problem was one of imagination. Of course, you can make an anti-capitalist first-person shooter. So even though I said violence is always othering, so create games that are nonviolent, explore that as a path, you probably can make a game that is about violence, that is not othering. It might be about violence, but I don't know how you're gonna play with that. But I guess the advice that I would give is to dream boldly, right? But really try to embrace the sort of big thinking, radical thinking paradigms. Try things that don't go together, pair things together that don't make any sense whatsoever, and see where that takes you. And read more, read widely, read literature, read fiction, read poetry, read much more than you are reading now. Those are my dream boldly and put things together that don't make sense and read more, not for class. That's my advice.
And as a non game studies person, but film studies person, to echo that final point. And hopefully Sondra Perry's piece inspires this, is also to think about yourself as engaged with many media at once. Just like the remix stylistics, you are everything and everything is you. So borrow, steal, remix, recreate, and whatever that you choose to innovate. And then always ask yourself, whom are you answerable to? And by answering that question, you are never above the work, but you are always engaged with people through the work. So I hope that's helpful.
It's very helpful. Thank you all so much.
Yes, and thanks to you as well, Jordan, and thanks to each of our speakers, Dr. Russworm, Dr. Murray, and Dr. Sheppard, for an incredibly inspiring conversation about an equally inspiring and brilliant work of art. I'd also like to thank all of our attendees who came today, and another thank you to my colleagues at the Davis, especially our student employees, for supporting our ongoing virtual format, and invite all of you to stay connected to us on our website and all of our social media platforms, where we're continuing our Davis at a Distance campaign and many resources, and look for announcements about our upcoming opening.